The water is black. Mahide is 24 years old, and she is standing at the edge of the Bosphorus in the hour before dawn, watching the surface of the strait ripple with currents that have carried bodies to the sea for 300 years. Her wrists are bound behind her back with silk cord, the same silk that adorned her chambers when she was still a favorite of the Sultan, when she slept on cushions embroidered with thread of gold and woke to servants who called her light of the harem. Now she stands in a cotton shift, barefoot on stones, still wet from the night's tide, her hair unbound and tangled by the wind that sweeps down from the Black Sea. The shift is thin enough that she can feel the cold penetrating to her bones, thin enough that the men who surround her can see the outline of her body beneath it. But modesty no longer matters. Nothing that happened to her body from this moment forward would be witnessed by anyone who would survive to speak of it. She can smell the water, salt and rot, and something darker underneath, the accumulated residue of centuries of disposal. She can smell the sweat of the men beside her, the mutes who serve the Bosi Bashi, the chief gardener whose actual duties have nothing to do with gardens. She can smell her own fear, sharp and animal, cutting through the perfumes that still cling to her skin from the hammam where she was washed. And prepared for this moment, they washed her carefully, almost tenderly. They oiled her hair and scented her skin, and dressed her in white as if preparing her for a wedding rather than an execution. The rituals of the harem extended even to death. A woman who had shared the Sultan's bed, who had borne the possibility of royal children, could not be disposed of carelessly. Her destruction required ceremony. Beside her on the stones rests a sack canvas, reinforced with leather at the seams, large enough to contain a human body. She has heard of these sacks since her first days in the harem, whispered about by older women who used them as warnings, as cautionary tales, as reminders of what happened to those who forgot their place. She never imagined she would see one prepared for her. Sack is not empty. She can hear sounds from within it, scratching, hissing, the rustle of scaled bodies moving against canvas, the high, desperate mewing of cats that have been starved for 3 days. In preparation for this moment, she knows what will happen. She has known since the moment the Kuzla Asar, the chief black eunuch, appeared at the door of her chamber with guards who did not speak. She knew when she was brought before the valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who pronounced judgment without allowing defense. She knew when the silk cord was wrapped around her wrists, and she was led through passages she had never seen before, downstairs that descended into the foundations of the palace, through gates that opened onto the waterfront where the boats of the condemned were moored. She will be sewn into the sack with the animals. The sack will be weighted with stones and thrown into the Bosphorus. She will sink into the black water while the starving cats claw at her flesh, while the snakes strike at whatever warmth they can find, while the weight drags her down into depths where no light penetrates. She will drown, but drowning will not be the worst of it. The worst will be the minutes before drowning, the chaos of animal terror combined with her own, the darkness and the cold and the creatures that share her final moments. This is the punishment for what she has been accused of doing, not convicted. Accused, in the Ottoman harem, the accusation was the conviction. The Sultan's word was law, and the Sultan's mother spoke with the Sultan's voice in matters concerning the women of the palace. Mahideen was accused of betraying the Sultan with a palace guard. She was accused of violating the most fundamental rule of the harem, the rule that made the entire system possible, the certainty that every child born to a sultan's woman was the sultan's child. She was accused of contaminating the bloodline that had ruled the Ottoman Empire for 200 years. She was innocent. She had never touched the guard she was accused of taking as a lover. She had never touched any man except the Sultan himself, who had called her to his bed perhaps 24 times over the 3 years she had been a concubine of the imperial household. But her innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was that another woman, a rival, who wanted her gone, had whispered the right words to the right ears. What mattered was that the valid Sultan believed or chose to believe or found it convenient to believe. What mattered was that Mahidvan had failed to produce a son in 3 years, making her expendable, making her removal a matter of housekeeping rather than tragedy. She thinks of her mother, who sold her to the slave traders when she was 12 years old, because the family needed money for her brother's apprenticeship. She thinks of the years in the training house, learning the arts that would make her valuable: music, poetry, dance, conversation, the 1,000 skills required of women who would serve in the houses of the powerful. She thinks of the day she was purchased for the imperial harem, the day she thought her fortune had been made, the day she entered the Topkapi palace believing she was ascending to a life of unimaginable luxury. She had not understood then what the luxury cost. She had not understood that the golden cage was still a cage, that the silk-lined walls could become a prison, that the same system that elevated her could destroy her on the word of a jealous competitor. She understands now. The Basti Bashi approaches. He is a large man, his authority visible in his bearing, his face expressionless in the way that men who conduct state murders learn to keep their faces. He nods to the mutes who stand beside Mahidvan, and they grip her arms, lifting her slightly off the stones. You may speak. The Basta Basha says, if you have final words, you may speak them now. Mahideen considers. She could protest her innocence again. She could curse the rival who betrayed her. She could beg for mercy that will not be granted. She could pray to Allah for forgiveness of sins she did not commit. Instead, she speaks the truth that will be buried with her in the black water of the Bosphorus. I was never unfaithful, she says. I loved the Sultan. I would have given him sons if he had given me the chance. What is done to me tonight is murder, not justice. The based Bashi's expression does not change. He has heard such words before. Every woman who faces this death proclaims her innocence. Some of them are lying, some of them are telling the truth. It makes no difference to him. His job is not to judge. His job is to carry out the judgment of others. It is time, he says. The mutes move forward with the sack. What you are about to learn has been systematically suppressed by Ottoman historians who preferred to celebrate imperial glory rather than document. Imperial horror, the archives of the Topkapi Palace contain records of thousands of women who entered the harem and simply disappeared from documentation, their fates indicated only by euphemisms that scholars have traditionally chosen not to examine closely. Tonight you will learn what those euphemisms meant. You will learn about the punishment system that the Ottoman Empire developed to control the most valuable and dangerous women in the Islamic world. You will learn about the sack drownings, the silent burrings, the living burials, the methods that were refined over 6 centuries of imperial rule. You will learn about the hierarchy of the harem, why some women were wives and others were concubines, what rights attached to each status, and how those rights affected the punishments available for their transgressions. You will learn why the Sultan's legal wives faced different deaths than his concubines, why some women were strangled while others were drowned, why some deaths were public warnings and others were silent disappearances. You will learn about the officials whose job it was to investigate, condemn, and execute the women of the imperial household, the Bosti Bashi with his mute executioners, the Kuzla Asa who served as prosecutor and judge, the valid sultan whose authority over the haram made her the most powerful woman in the empire and the most dangerous enemy any concubine could have. You will learn why other women of the harem were forced to witness these punishments, what function that witnessing served, how terror was used as a tool of governance in a world where hundreds of women competed for the attention of a single man. You will learn about the children, the sons who were strangled to prevent succession disputes, the daughters who were married off to eliminate potential claims, the pregnancies that were terminated because they came at inconvenient moments, the entire system of reproductive control that made the harem not merely a household but a machine for producing legitimate heirs while destroying any possibility of illegitimate ones. Subscribe if you want to understand what the Ottoman Empire actually was beneath the architectural beauty and the military conquests and the flowering of Islamic art and literature. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Mahidevran is about to be sewn into that sack and I am going to tell you exactly what happens inside it. But before I describe what she experienced in the black water of the Bosphorus, I need to take you back. I need to show you how the Ottoman harem functioned, why it was designed the way it was, and why the punishments for women who violated its rules were so extraordinarily brutal, because you cannot understand what happened to Mahidevran without understanding the system that killed her and the logic that made her death seem necessary to those who ordered it. The Ottoman harem was not what Western imagination has typically portrayed. It was not primarily a collection of sexual playthings maintained for imperial pleasure, though that element certainly existed. It was fundamentally a political institution designed to solve a problem that had plagued every dynasty in human history: how to ensure a legitimate succession while preventing the conflicts that competing heirs inevitably created. The problem was acute for the Ottomans because of their particular combination of circumstances, they were an absolute monarchy with all power concentrated in the person of the Sultan. They practiced a form of succession that did not automatically favor the eldest son, meaning that any son might potentially inherit the throne, and they ruled an empire so vast and wealthy that the stakes of succession were almost unimaginably high. These conditions created a recipe for civil war. If multiple princes survived to adulthood, they would inevitably compete for the throne. That competition would divide the empire, weaken its military capacity, invite intervention by foreign powers, potentially destroy everything the dynasty had built. The Ottomans developed two complementary solutions to this problem. The first solution was fratricide. When a new sultan ascended the throne, he was expected and eventually required by law to execute all his brothers. This practice, formalized by Sultan Mehmed II in the 15th century, eliminated competing claims by the simple method of eliminating competitors. The new sultan's brothers were strangled with silk bowrings, a method that shed no blood and was considered appropriately dignified for royal persons. Their bodies were then buried with honors, their potential threats to stability removed. The second solution was the harem system. By controlling all reproductive access to the sultan, the harem ensured that only authorized children would be born. Every woman who might potentially bear a royal child was confined within the palace, watched constantly, her sexuality managed by officials whose job was to know exactly when and with whom she had intercourse. No uncertainty about paternity could be permitted. The bloodline had to be pure. These two solutions were connected. The fratricide was possible only because the harem made it possible to know exactly who the sultan's sons were. Without certainty about paternity, the killing of brothers would become genocide of all possible relatives. Practice even the Ottomans found impractical, and the haram's extreme measures for punishing infidelity were necessary because the stakes of illegitimate birth were so high. A child of uncertain paternity might claim the throne. That claim might succeed. An impostor might rule the Ottoman Empire, breaking the sacred bloodline that gave the dynasty its legitimacy. The entire system of succession, the stability of the largest Islamic empire in the world, depended on absolute certainty that no such contamination could occur. This is why the punishments were so severe. This is why accusations were effectively convictions. This is why innocent women died alongside guilty ones. Why the system erred always on the side of elimination rather than risk. The cost of false positives, innocent women killed, was acceptable. The cost of false negatives, illegitimate children born, was catastrophic. The harem structure reflected these imperatives. At the top was the valid sultan, the sultan's mother, who ruled the harem with authority second only to the sultan himself. She had survived the system. She had borne a son who lived to take the throne. She had watched her sons' brothers strangled and had accepted this as necessary. She understood exactly what the stakes were and exactly what measures were required to manage them. Below the valid sultan were the sultan's legal wives, the cadonans, of whom there could be no more than 4. according to Islamic law, these women had formal status, legal rights recognized, positions in the imperial hierarchy. Their children were legitimate heirs. They could not be easily disposed of. Punishing a Kadun required process, justification, consideration of political implications. Below the Kadons were the concubines, the Iqbals and the Goes, women who had attracted the Sultan's attention and been called to his bed, but who had not been elevated to legal wife status. These women were more numerous, more expendable, more vulnerable. They had fewer protections. Their deaths required less justification. Below the concubines were the careers, the general population of the harem, women who served in various capacities but who had not yet attracted imperial attention. Some of these women would rise, most would not. They were the labor force of the harem, the servants and attendants who made the institution function, and threaded through this hierarchy were the eunuchs, the men who had been castrated specifically to serve in environments where unmodified men could not be trusted. The black eunuchs, the Kusaraso, and his subordinates were the administrators of the harem, the enforcers of its rules, the investigators of its violations. The white eunuchs served in other capacities throughout the palace. Together they formed a bureaucracy of surveillance that monitored every aspect of her life. This was the system Mahide entered when she was purchased for the imperial household at age 14. This was the world whose rules she learned to navigate over the following decade. This was the machine that would eventually kill her, not for any crime she actually committed, but because the logic of the system made her elimination convenient. Now let us return to the waterfront, where Mahide stands before the sack that will become her death chamber. The mutes approach with professional efficiency. One holds the mouth of the sack open, while others lift Mahidaran, ignoring her struggles, and insert her feet first into the canvas interior. The movement disturbs the animals already confined. Within, she can feel them writhing against her legs as she descends into the sack, their bodies frantic with the same terror she feels. The cats are the first to attack. Starved, maddened by confinement, they do not distinguish between the legs that have suddenly invaded their prison and any other available target. Claws rake across her calves, her thighs, drawing blood that the cats can smell, driving them to greater frenzy. She screams, but the sound is muffled as the sack rises around her, closing over her shoulders, her head sealing her in darkness. She is folded into a fetal position, her knees pressed against her chest, her bound wrists trapped behind her back. She cannot move, cannot protect herself, cannot do anything except feel the animals that share her confinement attacking her from every angle. The snakes are slower to respond than the cats, but more persistent. She feels them coiling around her limbs, their scales sliding across her skin, their bodies seeking warmth in the sudden darkness. Not all of them bite immediately. Some simply wrap themselves around whatever they can find, constrictors responding to contact with the pressure that is their only defense. She feels one circling her neck, feels another sliding across her face, feels the pressure building as the creatures react to her movements with their own defensive instincts, and then the sack is sewn shut, the opening closed by quick stitches that seal her inside. She feels the stones being attached to the bottom, the weight that will drag her down into the depths of the Bosphorus. She feels herself lifted, carried, the rocking motion of the men who hold her, adding to the chaos of animal movement within. She cannot see the water approaching. She can only feel the moment when she becomes weightless, the instant of falling, the shock of cold as the sack plunges beneath the surface. The water enters through the canvas, not immediately but steadily, filling the space around her, replacing air with the cold brine of the Bosphorus. The animals' frenzy intensifies as they feel themselves drowning. The cats claw desperately at anything within reach. The snakes bite reflexively at whatever touches them. Mahidran is bitten 11 times in the first 30 seconds. The wounds burn with venom that her body has no time to process. The claws have open gashes across her legs, her arms, her torso, wounds that bleed into water that grows redder with each passing moment. But the wounds are not what kills her. The water is what kills her. It fills her nose and mouth as she gasps for air that no longer exists. It fills her lungs as she inhales involuntarily, her body's reflexes overriding her mind's knowledge that there is nothing to breathe. She drowns in darkness, surrounded by creatures that are drowning with her. Her final sensations, a mixture of cold and pain and pressure, and the absolute knowledge that no one will ever know what happened to her in these final moments. The sack sinks, the current takes it. By the time the sun rises over the Bosphorus, there will be no trace that Mahide Devron ever existed. The sack drowning was not the only method the Ottomans used to punish women accused of infidelity. It was not even the most common method, but it was among the most terrible, reserved for cases where the offense was considered particularly egregious, or where the punishment needed to serve as a particularly emphatic warning. The history of this punishment predates the Ottoman Empire. Drowning in a sack with animals was practiced by the Romans, who called it pauina kul, the punishment of the sack, and reserved it for those who murdered their parents. The Ottomans adopted and adapted the practice, applying it to women whose sexual transgressions were seen as comparable to parricide, as murders of the dynasty's integrity. The choice of animals was deliberate. The cats represented domestic betrayal, creatures of the household turned against their keeper. The snakes represented corruption, the contamination that infidelity introduced into the sacred bloodline. Together they created a death that was not merely painful but symbolically appropriate, a punishment that fit the crime and the logic of Ottoman jurisprudence. The Bosphorus was the preferred location for these drownings because of its practical and symbolic properties. Practically, the currents carried bodies out to the Sea of Mara and eventually to the open Mediterranean.